but we recognize our limitations insofar as European unity is concerned. Americans cannot unify Europe. Europeans must do so. And we should not become involved in differences among Europeans in which our vital interests are not involved.
That was President Nixon on March 5th, 1969. Good evening, and welcome to the Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm your host, Mary Kissel. Thank you for tuning in tonight. We're joined by our co-chairs, Ambassador Robert O'Brien and Secretary Mike Pompeo, and our distinguished seminar members. Our topic, as the video clip suggests, the future of U.S.-European ties, a subject that has grown exponentially more important after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Iran's expanding aggression, and of course, the emerging threats from China. So welcome to you all. Secretary Pompeo, I'm going to kick it off with you tonight. This is an enormously complex subject. I'm not even sure we should talk about Europe as a coherent whole. So why don't we start just by laying the foundations. As it stands today, what are our common national security interests with the states in the continent of Europe and the UK?
Well, good evening, Mary, and great to be with everyone this evening. Look, it's that itself is a long answer, but let me try and identify two or three to get us started. First of all, we have a shared set of economic interests. And when I say that, we've got lots of places we are economic competitors, but in the central idea of a set of trading rules where property rights are respected, a set of understandings that say if you have an economic engagement, there's a court system to which one can fall back to if the transaction doesn't go the way you hoped, a set of currencies, the euro and the dollar, that are the world's leading currencies, a deeply intertwined financial set of markets. All of those make up a set of economic interests as a national security matter that make a lot of difference. If you contrast them with an economic model that looks like the Chinese Communist Party's economic model, or the Russian economic model, or even the model of a few other nations, that has provided a great deal of benefit has accrued to the United States as a result of that shared economic interest. Look, we certainly have more pure national security interests. We've worked on counterterrorism together for coming on 25 years now, right? Post 9/11, built out a very sophisticated set of intelligence cooperations with the Europeans and a very deeply intertwined set of counterterror operations that have delivered security for people in the United States and in Europe, and indeed all across the world. And then I guess the last thought would be is we have a shared set of values and interests that overlap in pushing back on the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Venezuelans, the Russians, then the Chinese, who have a model that is just so fundamentally different, a political economic model that is so different from ours, and one which none of us want to live under. And the United States and Europe, along with a bunch of partners elsewhere, will be the linchpins of delivering that. And you add, lastly, a deep historical relationship. Indeed, we busted away from the Brits a couple of 100 years plus ago, but a lot of history between us as well, which I think makes the relationship incredibly important, that far exceeds even the first three interests that I described.
Mr. Secretary, Ambassador O'Brien, I think that's all a great place to start. The foundation of the values, the economic interests in common, the military interests. But if you think about President Nixon, the Europe that he was facing was shrouded in the Iron Curtain. That's not true today. There's a different map of Europe, different nations even that didn't exist in Nixon's times. Are the major players today in Europe still the same as the ones that President Nixon courted so assiduously when he occupied the Oval Office?
Thanks, Mary. And I agree with Mike. I mean, when you think about Europe, it can be very frustrating dealing with the Europeans. But I think what we have to remember is Churchill's comment that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And we've got a tremendous set of allies in our European partners. And that history goes back, as Mike talked about, hundreds, if not thousands of years, from the Greek city-states to the Roman Republic to the Magna Carta. And all the immigrants that came and brought those ideas of freedom, and freedom was invented in the West. It was invented in Athens and Rome and in the fields around London, and when the knights demanded their rights from the king, and so we've got this tremendous set of values that goes back and binds us together, and as frustrating as the Europeans can be from time to time in dealing with them, Mike and I had those frustrations. There's also a great kinship and bond that we have. That we're collectively the West. We fought 2 world wars together. We fought Korea together. Yeah, and if we're going to prevail, and if freedom is going to prevail, if we're going to stand up to the CCP and their henchmen in North Korea and Pyongyang and their partners in Tehran and Moscow, we need the West on our side, and we need Europe on our side. That doesn't mean there are other great countries that I would call the West, and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and many other countries. But the heart and soul of the West is the Transatlantic Alliance, and we've got to figure out how to make it work. We've got to get the Europeans to share the burden. They've had a great run with America, shouldering much of the defense burden and national security burden over the last 50 to 100 years. But we need to get them on board, and we need to fight together as the West to make sure that freedom prevails for another generation.
Well, those frustrations that both you and the Secretary referenced obliquely, I want to dive into some of those. But before I do, I want to go to Nadia Shadlow, who, of course, was one of the principal authors of the National Security Strategy, one of the most seminal national security strategies insofar as it restored our focus on the big nation-state threats of today, kind of put us into the post-9/11 era. And I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. Nadia, as you were writing that and you were thinking about a relationship with our European partners, do you prioritize some partners over others? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
That's a tough question, Mary. That's one that's going to get me in trouble with our European friends. I think a couple of general things. First of all, there's no fundamentally, we're sort of talking a little bit around a debate today about how to keep America strong, how to ensure that we maintain our advantages and our strength, and then also have these strong relationships with allies and partners around the world. And in my view, there's no disconnect between the two, right? We can have a great nation and a strong nation at home and fix the things we need to do at home. And that's actually a separate set of people, authorities, monies, than in parallel maintaining and developing, strong relationships with allies and partners. By reducing those allied and partner relationships, we risk kind of reducing our freedom of action, right? We don't want to be boxed in, and allies and partners provide us with opportunities. Sure, they're challenging, right? They're challenges as well, but they also provide us with opportunities and options as we seek to balance and ensure that we're not boxed in by our adversaries. So it's complicated, but I think it's a false dichotomy to say that the two are somehow in conflict. So that's sort of an overall issue that I think we should all talk about. I think also it's important to recognize that Europe, some almost see Europe and they think of countries like Germany, right? Germany's not the only country in Europe. There are other countries in Europe doing really interesting things and things that are aligned with many of the things we worked on in the previous administration. Take Sweden, for instance. Sweden is dealing with problems of its border and sovereignty. Sweden is increasing its defense spending. Sweden has a sensible energy policy which acknowledges the role of nuclear power. It's doing a lot of things that would make most people on this call happy. It has a different set of policies than Germany. So I think we need to acknowledge the differentiated nature of our European allies. Some of them it'll be easier to work with. Some of it will be a push and pull by history. But back in the day, I remember Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld had this. I remember it was electrifying, not in a good way. Everyone Macron was very angry when he spoke about the new Europe and the old Europe, acknowledging that there were differences in the way that the Central European powers were dealing with some of their problems and the way that the more established, the Germany and France were dealing with some of the challenges.
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I'm so glad you raised it, that we can't really paint with that broad brush. There are distinct and important differences in the old versus the new Europe. Alex Wong, bringing you in here, I thought one of the more interesting initiatives during the Trump years was the focus on cultivating Central and Eastern European countries, noticing that they shared our economic aspirations. They were more productive. They worried more about the same states that we worried about, namely Russia. Just react to what Nadia, the Secretary and the Ambassador, said.
You're right. That was a priority of the Trump administration, but it does go back 20 years, as Nadia mentioned, with the remarks from Rumsfeld, which I think I still quoted many times today, of old Europe between and New Europe. And I don't downgrade or give short shrift to the value and the kind of invigorating spirit that the Baltic nations, Central European and Eastern European nations that do bring to Europe in our relationship with the continent. I don't, however, I don't want to give short shrift to the necessity that we do need to value and prioritize and strengthen our relationship with quote unquote old Europe, Germany, France, the UK. And that's for the simple reason that of the nations in Europe, they have the most actual and latent military power, economic power, and cultural influence throughout the world, and also a geopolitical mindset where they do feel that they are influential agents in international politics. And that's something that goes back deep into their strategic cultures. That's not something quickly developed within a nation. And working with them, because they have that mindset, they have that predilection to influence politics internationally. They are our allies, and we need them if we're going to win this overall strategic fight, whether it's with China, whether it's with a new axis China is leading with Russia and Iran and other bad actors around the world. And look, I'll also say just basic things. 2 of them are nuclear powers. 2 of them have vetoes of the Security Council. They are still important actors. Now, we need to use our newer the new Europe partners to maybe reinvigorate the overall NATO and EU partnerships to bring new focus, to bring new seriousness, whether it's on defense spending or technology controls or coordinated economic actions to balance China. But those powers, those Western European powers that have traditionally been the powers in Europe, will remain powers that we need to work with going forward.
Very, very, very interesting. I want to just go back very briefly, because we do have Kim Reed, the former chair of the Export-Import Bank, to talk a little bit more. What you're implying, Alex, though, is that we need a positive agenda and we need a strategy. And Kim, I wonder if you could speak to the 3 Cs initiative that we really worked hard on in those years to reinvigorate not just old relationships, but to bind together new ones.
Absolutely, Mary. I remember flying with Ambassador O'Brien over to Vietnam, and he had me immediately get on the phone with a key leader in a very important European country involved in something called the 3 Cs initiative. And for those viewers who are not familiar with it, I really encourage you to Google what it is. But essentially 13 countries in Eastern Europe, including Poland and Romania and Austria and Bulgaria and Croatia and some others in Greece now, very focused on connecting the north-south axis from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic and Black Seas in Central and Eastern Europe, so that we can really open up an important highway called the Carpathian Highway, but also to open up LNG access. We know how important American LNG is, and we want to be able to export it around the world. And so leaders in these countries continue to work on this effort. At the time, late 2020, I was with Ambassador Georgette Mosbacher of Poland and Adrian Zimmerman of Romania from the Trump administration, but really going at it hard to help these countries focus in get more U.S. exports, become less dependent upon energy from Russia. And so we really want to see that continue and build up that strength. So,
Nadia said you wanted to jump in, Nadia, to comment on what Kim said.
Oh no! After after Kim.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Back to you, Kim. Keep going.
So I just want to encourage that relationship and partnership. I'm glad that Greece has joined, and we want to see this continue on into the next presidential administration.
Well, I mean, it looks very prescient. If only those nations had jumped in all the way back then, maybe it wouldn't have been such a shock when Russia invaded Ukraine and everyone had to disengage from the Russian energy pipeline. Okay, Nadia,
I think it links to the jumping in point of creating. I think right now Europeans tend to be on the defensive, right? They're extremely nervous and scared and sort of in a hunkered down position for just nervous about what the United States is going to do. But if you flip it and have an attitude that says, what can we bring to the table? What new initiatives can we drive? How can we start to be part of this reinvigoration with some changes in the alliance? How do we do that? It shouldn't all be driven by Americans, right? And so I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks about that. Have them drive some of the agendas and discussions.
Right. Well, Secretary Pompeo, let's talk about that, and let's start to talk about some specific issues that many of our viewers have heard about or have opinions about. And with NATO, let's start there, because the military alliance is obviously one of the linchpins of the relationship between Washington and the nations on the continent. How do you assess the strength of that relationship, the commitment of our major European partners to NATO? Please, sir, we'd love your point of view.
You bet. Let me start with a little history, which is that, almost 40 years ago now, I was a young soldier serving in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, a part of NATO's front line, patrolling what was the then East German border, which of course no longer exists. And on Saturdays, I might go downtown and maybe I'd wander into a bar. And, there were German kids sitting there. And, what was this kid from Southern California doing on the East German border when the Germans were sitting at the bar? And I do bring that thought because for an awfully long time, they have depended far too much on the United States for their own security. And I mean that both for the good of America and for their own good. In the end, we all know that there's very little help as good as self-help. And they've not faced the imperative for self-help sufficiently, nor have their elected leaders made the case for why it is they should do that for themselves. Their elected leaders have simply said, no, we'd rather sell cars in China or wine in Asia. But, that hard stuff of building aircraft carriers and putting Marine brigades together, that's an American thing far too often. And so, everyone focuses on the 2% of GDP as the objective that they set out for themselves. Many nations now making it, some trying to, some no intention of actually delivering on that. But it's beyond that. It is also a cultural imperative for them. It's not just about how much money one allocates towards a particular purpose. That it is, are the people of your nation sufficiently informed about the risks that your country faces? And are they prepared to do the right thing to ensure that their kids and their grandchildren live in a world that they want them to live in? One shouldn't look to any other country. That is, no European country should look to their brothers and sisters in Europe, nor should they look across the Atlantic to the United States for that. In the first instance, they ought to work to deliver that for themselves. There's a paragraph. Second paragraph. NATO's really important and has a long history and has been enormously beneficial to the United States. Our security is far enhanced because we have been an important part of NATO and, in fact, have led NATO now for 70 plus years. I could easily make the case against, anyone in my party or any place else who had a different view of that, about the benefits that have accrued, as a historical matter to the United States of America. We can all argue about what it might mean in the future, but you need to look no further than Afghanistan to recall that Article 5 has only been used once, and it was when we asked everybody to come help us push back against the events of 9/11 in our own country. We could spend a lot of time talking about that. NATO thus has to be fit for purpose. And I really think this is what we were trying to do, and President Trump was trying to do in a serious way. Other presidents had made the same arguments about the failure of some NATO nations to adequately prepare themselves. But we went at it hammer and tong, and it made a lot of people mad. I lived it. Mary, you worked with me. You heard it and saw it.
Sure did.
And it made them mad for two reasons, I think. And for the Europeans that are watching us tonight, I hope you'll take this precisely how it's intended. It made them mad for two reasons. One is they really wish we would just stop bothering them with facts. And second, I think there was a little bit of, you all have got this massive economy, innovation, and it was not only wishing we would do more, but envy that we were willing and capable to do more. I think those both existed in some European countries, and then we shouldn't lump them all in together because that's not fair. But nonetheless, that juxtaposition of, gosh, we wish you'd do more, and boy, it's too bad you're doing so much, may be most prevalent in some of the thoughts that you'd hear President Macron speak to, right? He talks about a European defense and then complains that we're not doing more. Fair enough. I'm happy with those criticisms, but in the end, I think about this in terms of what it means to us, and we should be doing our level best to ensure that Europe is prepared to do what it needs to do, and we all need to do what is required to ensure that the Ukrainians can stand up to the aggression taking place there today. Last thought on this. Even inside of NATO, we talked about Europe having different views. Even inside of NATO, we shouldn't forget that these are fraught and pitched battles. Should we put more forces in Poland or Romania? Should we station them in Germany? Are the Turks going to still have the S-400? A Russian air defense system that makes it difficult for the United States to fly alongside of them. Even inside of the NATO umbrella, there is not a uniform view of exactly the right way to proceed. And so the country that is most capable of bringing these forces together to marshal them appropriately to ensure American security is, of course, us in the United States. And so our role as a leader there is something I don't walk away from. I am proud of, and hope that we will all be able to deliver a stronger, more capable NATO to confront not only our European adversaries, namely Russia, but make no mistake about it, the Chinese Communist Party is chasing NATO around the world as well in so many ways.
Yeah, it is interesting that China is now a regular topic of discussion within the halls of NATO, although, of course, the Ukraine war has, in some respects, obscured that conversation. Ambassador O'Brien, what struck me is just how similar these debates are over the decades. There's a National Security Council memo from 1970 where the Nixon administration says, and I'm going to quote here, he says, the president would welcome having the European NATO funds used to shore up and build up the local strength of the member countries' armed forces. It's the same debate that they were having in 1970 that we're having today. That being said, is NATO the best functioning kind of tie between the United States and Europe for all of its problems and all of our haranguing of them to do more for their own defense?
Well, Mary, you're absolutely right about the historical nature of this debate that we've been having with our European partners and friends. I went back and did a little survey when President Trump took office and looked at the campaign platforms of the GOP and Democratic Party from 1968 onwards. And funny enough, both parties, Republican and Democrat, Jimmy Carter had some of the toughest language, demanded burden sharing, and the Europeans pay their fair share. Unfortunately, no president, even a hero of mine, Ronald Reagan, and I know a hero of many people on this show and the viewers who are watching, even President Reagan couldn't get to the Europeans to pay their fair share. The first president who was able to do it was Donald J. Trump. And granted, his rhetoric, and I think of the lead up to the NATO summit that Mike and I attended with President Trump in 2019, And his rhetoric was tough. He talked about people not paying their dues, not at the country club, not being able to get tea time, and likened that to NATO. But what it allowed us to do in those negotiations, and Mike had a number of countries, I had a number of countries, and we worked with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. We were able to go in and say, look, the time of Europe not paying their fair share, not burden sharing, is over. And at the end of that summit, and we had some great meetings. I know Mike remembers them well. I do. And there was a lot of tough love to spend. But at the end of the summit, we got $400 billion in additional NATO spending outside of the U.S. over 10 years. And that money was critical because what it started doing, they started expending it and buying upgraded new Western materials, especially in Eastern Europe, the Eastern European countries, and upgrading their platforms in the West. And 2 years of that spending started to allow, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, it started to allow the Europeans to take their older stockpiles and send them immediately to Kiev and to contribute to the defense of Ukraine against the Russian invasion. That's a direct result of the NATO summit and a direct result of President Trump's tough love that he gave his European allies. The other thing I'll point out is that at the end of the war in Afghanistan, we had 5,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan and only 2,500 American troops. So the burden sharing just wasn't on the expense side, it was on the troop side. And that was very important to us. And again, tough negotiations to make that happen, but we got the Europeans fully on board. So, having hard negotiations, showing a little strength, it upset some people at the CFR and at the Atlantic Council and some of the establishment folks. But what it did is it made Europe better, it made Europe safer, and it made America safer. So again, the partnership is critical. I don't think there's been an alliance in the history of the world, maybe except for Rome and Latin allies in the wars against Hannibal. But other than that, I think NATO's been the most successful enduring alliance. And like Mike, when he patrolled the border of East Germany, I remember as an exchange student going through Checkpoint Charlie. And it was terrifying with the Alsatian dogs and the Eastern German border guards and the forced conversion of whatever Deutschmarks you had into Ostmarks, which were worthless. You'd only buy cake and ice cream over there with them. Walking over in 501 jeans and having the kids approach you and ask to buy your jeans from you, desperate to get a taste of freedom. And that's all gone. So when we think of the success of NATO, we think of the ending of the Cold War, we think of the liberation of East Germany, of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, of course, Romania, Bulgaria, all the Baltic states, the captive nations that we used to refer to in the old days of the Cold War, the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. I mean, this is one of the great things that's happened in the history of the world. And it's a direct result of NATO. And now NATO has the opportunity to stand for freedom against Iran, against Russia, against China and their henchmen in places like Managua and Havana and Caracas and other dismal places and help us be the beacon of liberty. And so we got to keep the alliance alive, but we also need to make sure that the Europeans really do get engaged in meaningful burden sharing and not just hitting the 2% number and lumping our healthcare system into the defense budget, but really putting some meat in the hard power bones. But that's what's going to help keep us free, and it's important to nurture that alliance and recognize the freedom that's given the world over the past 70 years, as Mike pointed out.
Nadia, I want to go to you now, because you raised the issue of Sweden and also the idea that our European partners should act for themselves. Well, we do have a change in the institution of NATO. We do have new entrants. We have Finland, we have Sweden. And I'm not sure that had anything to do with the United States. I think it had a lot more to do with Moscow and Russian aggression. How does that change the nature of NATO to have those countries added? I do want to move on to some of the other aspects of U.S.-European ties, like political ties, et cetera. But I'm staying on this military aspect because it is just so important and so immediate, given the Ukraine war.
Well, it gives us real added capabilities. I mean, the beauty of those additions, Finland and Sweden, they're serious countries are serious about developing capabilities, and they have capabilities. And these are capabilities that are, hard to develop. It took a long time, as Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien have said, to have the NATO that we have. Weakening it it would be incredibly difficult to recreate those relationships. And they provide real defense benefits to the United States, hard power benefits, the ability of our troops to train together, to learn from that training, to operate in an integrated way, to understand, to work through the complexities of warfare today. NATO gives us all that. So it provides us with real hard power benefits, not to mention the intelligence benefits and things that the Secretary would know more about. So I think Finland and Sweden bring hard power to the alliance, which is great. I think they probably bring some fresh ideas, which is great too. And I think they just reaffirm to everyone that these capabilities matter, and perhaps challenge some of the other alliance members to up theirs even more. But it's really hard to recreate or reproduce or rebuild if we made some of the wrong decisions. Thanks.
I totally second everything Nadia just said there, but it goes to this larger necessity and opportunity that we have this year for the United States really to lead a strategic rethink with NATO about its mission in this new world with the new threats that we're facing. So this year is the 75th anniversary of NATO. Washington is hosting the NATO summit this summer. And I will be frank, I am a bit fearful that the Biden administration will fumble this opportunity to have a serious discussion with our NATO allies, because it is in one of our own election years. There will be an incentive to make this summit more about perhaps drawing what I think is an unfair contrast between the Biden administration's quote unquote support for NATO and Trump's quote unquote non-support for NATO. I don't think that's a fair assessment, but I think that's the political temptation that the Biden White House will face. Instead of it being a political event, it should be a serious opportunity, as Nadia says, with these new members to say what capabilities are they bringing and how does it affect the mission of NATO? And what is the mission of NATO? What is the strategy vis-a-vis not just Russia and Ukraine, but globally facing revisionist powers that are working more in concert, and being very clear about that, and then saying, where do we need to go? We, meaning all of the allies, on defense spending. Not just 2%, not just that as a kind of arbitrary goal, but who needs to bring what to the fight? Who needs to be spending more? Who should be bearing more burdens, whether it's Germany or UK or Canada? And being very serious about that. And this is an opportunity. And if they can't have this discussion now, after 2 years of a war, the first major land war in Europe in many decades, if they can't have that conversation now, I don't know when they're going to have it.
Well, Kim, should we not be cynical about Washington? Is there any reason to be hopeful for the kind of progress Alex is talking about in the relationship on the military side?
I am a true believer in the policies that we upheld in the Trump administration. And looking back at the wonderful documents that you can access at the Nixon Library, they have a document on the Declaration of the Atlantic Relations that came out during a NATO celebration. And I will point any historian to item number 4, because I hope that the Biden administration, along with all the NATO member countries, will put out something like this again. But it speaks to, and I quote, although countries in the alliance remain vulnerable to attack, the nature of the danger to which they are exposed has changed. And they're talking over the past few years. The alliance's problems in the defense of Europe have thus assumed a different and more distinct character. So I'm going to be watching with a very critical and protective eye to see what is discussed at the 75th anniversary, the second week of July. And I'm also going to be looking this Thursday. President Biden is delivering the State of the Union. And I'm hoping that we're going to see some good news there as well. But I'm fearful because I believe that this Russian invasion is a time for Europe to change direction on so many things: energy, regulation, security, technology, so much. And I just hope that the Biden does not continue to impose some European policies here. Even, I'm in the world of finance and economics, and the SEC is going to be holding a public meeting tomorrow to vote on some climate rules that we've been watching for 2 years to come out, Chairman Gary Gensler. And I've heard him speak before, and he knows that the European rules and the California rules already are helping U.S. companies do what their vision is. But we will see more regulation and more bureaucracy and burden put on companies tomorrow.
Well, if there's one thing that European nations can agree on, it's to regulate U.S. companies down to their level so that they can compete with some of our tech giants, like Google and Apple and the rest. As the Secretary and the Ambassador have said, the relationship is not without frustrations. Kim, you raise a lot of really interesting points there. Most notably, what level of crisis is it going to take for European nations to realize that their national security interest is aligned with us and to start to take a bigger role? And yet Germany will not send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. The French president stands up in Prague just in these last days and said it will not be appropriate not to be a coward in Ukraine. He's floated sending French troops to Ukraine. And yet, where's the beef? Secretary Pompeo, what was the diplomatic relationship like with a nation like France or a nation like Germany? And how much does it depend on the politics of the day and the interpersonal relationships more than anything else?
Oh, goodness. There's a historic overlay, obviously, but the people matter. The political parties matter for sure. Who's in power in those places makes an awful lot of difference about how they think about the way in which to interact with the United States. When I became the Secretary of State, so I think, 16, 17 months into the Trump administration, we were literally days away from withdrawing from the JCPOA. And we were with the E3, we were at loggerheads. They wanted to trade with Iran, and we wanted to defeat the world's largest state sponsor of terror.
You just translate the JCPOA as the Obama era Iran deal. The
Sure.
E3
it's the nuclear deal, and this had become an article of faith for them. They tried everything to go around our sanctions regime, to create their own trading system, which was an epic failure in spite of all of their efforts. But I mean, these conversations with my counterparts, the various foreign ministers in the UK and Germany and France, they came at this as they came at this the same way they had a different view on the Iraq War, right? They viewed this as another piece of American not understanding at the Middle East. The way to co-opt them was to trade there. And so that was my first interactions with them in that role were on that particular issue, and it got no easier. The next thing we really tackled, which annoyed them, was essentially Chinese infrastructure in their telecommunication systems. We created what became known as the Trusted Network to drive Huawei out and the other Chinese technologies, and we used pretty strong set of both rhetorical flourish combined with real hard power. That is, we're not going to communicate with you if you have Chinese systems in your networks and your infrastructure. We won't feel like our information is safe, and therefore, Godspeed, keeping your embassy going. So we were serious about trying to drive through the economic agenda that we thought made sense for them and we knew made sense for us. And so these were a very difficult set of conversations. You add to that the NATO overlay, where we were clearly jawboning them. The fact that we were trying to get them to step away from Nord Stream 2, that is essentially reliance on Russia for a significant amount of their industrial natural gas and retail natural gas. So there were just a host of issues where we were just in very different places about how to achieve what I think was a common set of objectives, but was clearly aimed at benefiting Europe at the expense of the United States, allowing us to tackle these hard global problems that they knew in their heart needed to be tackled, but they just as soon pushed them off for another day. And then you had the various leaders. We had Chancellor Merkel, a couple different prime ministers in the United Kingdom, beginning with Prime Minister May. Very different from Margaret Thatcher and Chancellor Kohl, right? So President Reagan had a very different set of interlocutors than we did, with a very different agenda set. I'll give you one last item that we came at them to try and explain what we were doing and why, and I think they will regret having not paid more attention. I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but this issue of migration into Europe out of Africa is a staggering risk for my people in Italy, the biggest border that is hard to defend, but on and up through the heart of Europe as well. And we were working on our southern border diligently to secure it, to create a sovereign America, urging them to do the same in their countries. And Chancellor Merkel and President Macron viewed our efforts as, to put it bluntly, racist and indecent. I think the Europeans are going to have to get as serious as America. I wish America were today as well. This issue of migration, how is it we're going to manage this human flow from the global south into the global north, will be a defining issue of the next 20 or 25 years. It will reshape the landscape of Europe and the United States if we aren't both treating the global south properly and then ensuring that migration is lawful and only lawful migration into each of these places. And we could not have been in a more different place on any of those issues than we were with most of our European counterparts, save maybe for Hungary, who understood migration the migration risk to sovereignty and national security the same way that we did.
And yet welcomed in the Chinese Communist Party and Huawei and
go figure.
It was a complicated set of relationships, but it's such an interesting point that we share common problems across different geographies. You mentioned Italy. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has taken a tougher stance on migration, but should we be sharing best practices and sharing intelligence about who's coming over these borders? Ambassador O'Brien, jump in here. Do we underestimate the benefit that we get from working on these common issues, even if they are in different geographies?
Well, that's a great point, Mary. And while I agree with everything Mike said about the front relationships on some of these big policy issues, when you look at the military issues, the day-to-day operability and interoperability of our forces and French and British forces, because when it comes to NATO, look, at the end of the day, it's the French and the British that have significant, serious firepower that they can deploy overseas. We went to the British and encouraged them to finish building their 2 carriers, because if the Prince of Wales and the Queen Elizabeth, they're 2 brand new aircraft carriers that are flying American F-35s on, including the F-35 squadrons of the United States Marine Corps, because they don't have enough of their own. So we've got a real interoperability where we've got U.S. fighter pilots and jets on British carriers. If they can patrol the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic, that frees up an additional carrier for us to send to the Pacific to confront the Chinese and deter them from their malign activities with respect to Taiwan and other areas. With the French, we worked closely with them in Africa. And Michael, remember, we did a hostage rescue in which the French dispatched a team. We got the intel for them. I was in Paris, gave it to them. I was a hostage envoy at the time, working for Secretary Pompeo and President Trump. And they sent their commandos in and unfortunately lost 2 commandos, but saved 4 hostages, including an American woman who they brought home safely. And so there's a lot of capability and long reach for both the French and the British, nowhere near us, but on a smaller scale, as Alex pointed out, real hard power. And so sometimes we have to deal with the big policy issues, but at the same time, we need to make sure we remain interoperable and coordinated in a very strong fashion on the military side to get things done. So there's still far more benefit to NATO and good relations with all our European partners than detriment. But at the same time, they have to recognize the threats. I mean, Germany had a German first foreign policy, but no one called Angela Merkel out for having a German first foreign policy. I mean, they imported cheap Russian commodities and oil, gas, agricultural products. They produced high-end finished goods, sold them, Audis. If you've ever been to Beijing, it's a sea of black Audis and Mercedes and BMWs. They sold high-end products to Germany. They used that money for a social welfare system that's incomparable. and we paid for their defense and defend them. So what's not to like for a German industrialist or a German politician in that setup? But we had to call them out on it, and those were uncomfortable conversations. But we have to understand they were doing what was good for Germany, but only because we allowed it. And so we have to, again, show tough love, show partnership, show solidarity with our European allies, but also make sure that they're, playing ball on the same side, and they understand the threats. I think they understand the Russian threat now. A little too little, too late. I hope it's not too little, too late when it comes to the China threat and the CCP threat. But I think we're getting there. We need to continue to work with them and having good relationships with the leaders, with President Macron and certainly Boris Johnson. I remember something that we did for Boris Johnson, and Mike will remember this well, that when he was stricken with COVID, he had a very serious case of COVID. At the time, we had some experimental drugs. We rushed using a military jet to England to get to him in London. He ultimately didn't use them, but those are the sorts of gestures and things that we can do for our allies that build those strong relationships at the leader level that can ultimately translate into policy victories.
And those are stories that don't get a lot of attention in the public arena. I think it also highlights, Ambassador, some of the positive things we can do, positive gestures, positive incentives. Alex, I want to bring you in here for that kind of creative thinking. I think a lot of the discussion about the U.S.-European relationship is about punishment or threats, but there are things that we can do to encourage them to bind themselves more tightly to us, given our copacetic, capitalist economic systems, or encourage them to produce and to build up their military industrial base. I mean, are there the things that we can do that incentivize them to stand with us more than they stand with the Irans of the world?
Yeah, no, I thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit more positively about opportunities going forward. And, because this is 2024, no conversation is complete without a mention of AI. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because I think it really is an opportunity for the United States and our European partners to work together on what can be, a general foundational technology that'll move forward our economies, and particularly do it in a way where we are outcompeting the Chinese. A lot of people are aware, of OpenAI and American companies that are, fostering this AI development. But it's interesting stuff happening in Europe too. Obviously, the manufacturing, well, maybe not obviously, but the manufacturing technologies are located in a number of Dutch and German companies that are really key to the overall supply chain of the semiconductors, the high-end semiconductors that are needed to train these AI models. That's number one. You have an interesting company coming out of France that's developing their own models in a much more efficient way, a large language model called Mistral. You have interesting strategies being fostered all the way up to the leader level by Rishi Sunak in the UK on AI, and you're seeing similar AI strategies coming out of France. So what I'm seeing here is at least a nascent effort to foster AI development in a prudent way that does not hopefully quash innovation. You had mentioned before, Mary, the tendency of Europe to smother innovation, and they truly missed the last internet software revolution. You can't think of a European country that is a quote unquote tech giant or a tech innovator. This is their chance to do it because they have some of the manufacturing capability. And there's a strategic imperative where if they work with us prudently in a coordinated way, regulate data, regulate these large language models in a way that, again, that is prudent and improves and encourages innovation, we can beat the Chinese on this. On top of that, I do think between the United States and Europe, we have more overall skilled workforce. And I'm not talking about the high-end, kind of elite researchers in AI. I'm simply talking about engineers throughout industry that can take whatever those engineers create and diffuse it throughout the economy so that AI empowers overall industries. I don't think they have that in China. They have a lot of researchers, they have a lot of people, but their education system's not great. Can they take AI breakthroughs, particularly in a closed society, and diffuse it to where they are moving their economy forward? There's big questions about that. If we can do that together with Europe, that is a huge economic and technological advantage for us. That's an opportunity that I don't think is that far away. I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see some of this play out.
No, I think.
Can I jump in on something Alex just said? This AI is so critical. When I had my list of the things as national security advisor that we had to stay ahead of the Chinese on, it was quantum AI, hypersonics, but AI was right at the top of the list. The Chinese have an advantage over us because of scale. They've got 1.3 billion people. we've got 340, 350 million in America. But if you combine NATO, America, Five Eyes, and Japan, you've got roughly an equivalent population. We've got the same scale that the Chinese have, and we can, defeat them even where they have their best advantage, which is population scale. We can match or defeat them on that. Not to mention the expertise that Alex talked about. So again, another reason to stay close to our allies is cobbling together that sort of a coalition that can match the Chinese on the scale front, which is going to be critical for when it comes to AI and these large learning models.
Yeah, and I think we also shouldn't make the mistake of just talking about government to government ties, as I think Alex and the ambassador are highlighting. The U.S. remains the EU's largest trading partner. There's an enormous amount of private exchange that happens between our economies. It's very positive, and there's room to grow it. Secretary Pompeo, I want to bring you in, if I may, on another bucket of the relationship, which is the intelligence side, given that you were head of CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. How important is that relationship in light of Hamas's invasion of Israel and Putin's invasion of Ukraine? What do the Europeans contribute, and how might we broaden or deepen those relationships?
Mary, this is a place where you really do see what Ambassador O'Brien was speaking about in the commercial space. You actually see this division of expertise take place. Many of the European countries, including some of the smaller ones, have, it's not fair to call them niche. They're bigger than that. They're more important than that, but have a relatively narrow, incredibly deep set of capabilities. Look, everybody knows the fame of GCHQ in the United Kingdom. But some of the abilities in Finland and Sweden, some of the stuff the Nordic nations do, some of the capabilities that exist in some of the southern European countries as well, quieter yet very unique and highly complementary to not just the CIA but the broader U.S. intelligence community, including our Department of Defense intelligence warriors as well. And so they are, they are incredibly capable. Nobody has the scale and breadth of the United States, but each of them has the capacity to bring something unique. And it's frankly easier to do in some ways than it is in the context of big army or large forces or very big sophisticated systems. But as innovation and technology begin to pervade not only the intelligence community but the broader military defense set of capabilities, I am very confident that some of these nations will continue to be highly additive and complementary to what the U.S. intelligence community is delivering. They were great counterterrorism partners, I should say. Most of them were great counterterrorism partners, but they understood too that there was a network effect to this, and they were important parts of that intelligence network as well.
Secretary, while I've got you, could you comment on Europe's contribution to the effort to support Kyiv in their war against Vladimir Putin's invasion?
So I'll give them a B, maybe a B plus, if you have to assign a grade. And what I mean by that is I actually think I think the United States, President Biden and his team have been too self-congratulatory to think, gosh, how great is it that we stopped them on the doorstep of Kyiv? I think just perverts the central thesis of deterrence, right? No, you mean we've allowed tens of thousands of Ukrainians to die when deterrence would have been a model that could have prevented that. Having said that, the Europeans have stepped up. They've provided some weapon systems, some financial resources as well. They've filled in some gaps that the United States either wouldn't under President Biden or couldn't, and scaled some of that. And then again, the last thought would be, and you have to not just talk about Europe. Clearly, if you think of how have the Swedes and the Poles and the Romanians and the Brits stepped up, how have some of the other European countries stepped up? They wouldn't all get the same grade. They would have had this challenge very different. You've seen the big fights inside the EU. Who's going to provide it? Who's going to pay for it? So they are not all unanimous about the right approach either. But I credit them. Last thought here is I hope that some of what has transpired in Europe to, I think this was Alex's point earlier, maybe it was Nadia's or maybe both. I hope this wasn't just a jailhouse conversion. When once a country is paroled, once a prisoner is paroled, they go back to their old ways. I hope that the idea of depending on Russia for a central feature of your economy is gone forever. I hope that the idea that the failing to do adequate level of work will deter our adversaries. The idea that somehow history has ended and Vladimir Putin is no longer evil and intent on greater Russia. I hope those ideas have been banished for all time and not just in the moment. There will come. The kinetic piece of this conflict will come to an end. The desire of evil to roam free in Europe will not end while Russia is still under the power of Vladimir Putin and those like him. And so I hope the Europeans won't see a moment where the conflict is less heated as the opportunity to go back to business as usual as it had been for the last 20 or 30 years.
Ambassador O'Brien, you have many friends and professional contacts in Europe. I think we may have lost him. Maybe the Russians cut the feed. Oh, no, there he is. Ambassador O'Brien, as I was saying, you have a lot of connections to Europe and travel there and, speak to your friends and partners. And, is there reason to hope that this wasn't, as the Secretary put it, a jailhouse conversion to invest more in their defense and to cut the ties with Moscow?
Well, I think it was jailhouse conversion for many European countries. Now, the question is, Mike pointed out, is it going to hold? Is it a true conversion where their hearts changed, where their minds changed? And you hope for it. So I was at a conference in Prague not too long ago, a defense conference, and a German CDU member who was chairing one of their key committees in the parliament there came and said, Ambassador, you were right about everything. Trump was right about everything. Pompeo was right about everything. And we shouldn't have relied on Nord Stream 2. We shouldn't have continued to have this idea that trade and good relations with Russia will change the very nature of Vladimir Putin, as Merkel thought. And he seemed genuinely chastened by what had happened in Ukraine and genuinely concerned about what was happening to Ukrainian people. Now, so there's been good talk from Germany and some of the other countries, but we haven't seen the action yet. So Germany's a massive economy. They've committed to 2% of their GDP to NATO. They've committed to supporting Ukraine. The EU is committed to bringing Ukraine in, which is much less problematic than NATO because it wouldn't lead to an immediate Article 5 conflict with Russia for the rest of us, for the other NATO countries. And yet still the EU has not let Ukraine in. Still Germany hasn't provided the level of aid that it's promised. And we still don't have a credible plan of how Germany is going to even spend the 2% because their industry can't produce what they need. They don't have the young German guys who are at the bar that Mike remembered, willing to sign up for the German army. And so we'll have to see how it all plays out. But I think there are positive signs. I think some Europeans really get it. We've seen the French actually invest money in their defense, and they're very close to the 2% number. And soon to be taken more seriously. They pulled troops out of Africa to get ready for more of a great power conflict. But as Kim pointed out, the Europeans like to regulate more than innovate, and they're with DMA-style legislation, they're hurting American tech companies and letting the Chinese tech companies run wild. They still have the immigration policy problems that Secretary Pompeo pointed out. So we'll have to see. I mean, the language is good. The testimony after the conversion is good. But we'll see if they stick to the path. If they do, it's going to be a great day for freedom, and there may be a well-disguised silver lining out of Vladimir Putin's evil act in invading Ukraine. We may end up with a stronger Europe, a stronger West, and a more capable West. But that has not. That still has to play out. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen enough concrete results to make that prediction yet. I hope it does. I pray it does. And as Alex pointed out, we need to see leadership from Washington. Even in the current administration, and look, I think everyone on this call would like to see a change in administrations, but for the good of America, I hope that President Biden continues to follow and encourage the Trump policies as it applied to NATO, and develop more capability there, and a stronger alliance, not just a word fest and a kumbaya singing, love fest of a final communique, which is meaningless, but real reform, real change, and real capability increases so that freedom lives another generation. That's the key here. That's what it's all about at the end of the day.
That's true. We're going to try something different as we've only got a minute left. We'll have quick final words from the seminar members. Kim, over to you.
Well, just want to echo Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien's comments. I like to talk about something called the Brussels effect, which was a term coined for the notion that setting regulatory standards would somehow make Europe a more prosperous global leader. And no matter what they think of the United States, and many of them think negative things, President Trump is clearing the deck right now today on Super Tuesday, and our policies really worked. And as we know, our unemployment rate is 3.5%. Europe's is 6% right now. European countries have bought $20 billion of Russian fossil fuels, and 40% of Russian gas goes to Europe. Please wake up and strengthen our relationship.
Wake up. We've got now 30 seconds left between Alex and Nadia. Alex, over to you.
Just quickly, the Europeans began using this term to refer to China as a systemic rival. Systemic in terms of security, politics, economics, technology. I think that term is great because it's true and it describes the scope of the problem. But now that they have the right term, the right concept, they have to start acting like it and put grist behind and real policy behind that concept.
Nadia, last word to you.
I would just add Alex's point. A system implies in our sense, we also believe that we're in this systemic rivalry with China, and as a part of that system, we become stronger if we work with our allies and partners.
Shall we say stronger together?
Stronger together.
Stronger together. Well, thank you to our esteemed co-chairs, to our trustee seminar members, the Nixon Foundation, and of course to all of you for watching. This wouldn't be possible without you. Thank you. That's it for this month's Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm Mary Kissel. Good night.